Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's fireside chat on best practices for integrating the patient voice in clinical trials in rare disease. My name is Chris Rao, Senior Vice President of Research and Clinical Development here at Alira Health. I can see that we're still missing a few participants, so we'll wait a couple of minutes to allow everyone to arrive. Again, hello, everyone. Welcome to today's fireside chat, clinical trials in rare disease, best practices for integrating the patient voice. Again, my name is Chris Rao, Senior Vice President of Research and Clinical Development here at Alira Health. I'm going to be our host for today's fireside chat. So before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items just so you know how to participate in today's event. So first of all, please be advised that all participants are muted. However, you can still engage with us by asking questions. You can do that by typing your questions into the toolbar. However, you also can send in your questions at any time during the discussion. We'll collect them as we go, and then we'll address those questions during the Q&A session at the end of the discussion. Just to note that today's session is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording following the fireside chat. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce the organizer of today's event, Alira Health. Alira Health is an international patient-centric and technology-enabled advisory firm, and our mission is to humanize healthcare. So we offer a full spectrum of services, including research and clinical development solutions, technology-powered consulting, and real-world evidence. If you'd like to learn more about us and our patient-centric approach, I invite you to have a look at the materials in the download section of your webinar tool. And there you can also find some of our latest materials focused on patient engagement, for example, literature review of the articles on patient involvement in health technology assessment agencies. So the scope of today's fireside chat is to discuss practical suggestions on how to engage patients in the clinical trial process and to cover such topics as improving the design of your clinical trials through the involvement of patient representatives, choosing outcomes relevant to patients, and increasing patient retention and compliance through early engagement. So without further ado, let me introduce today's guests. So we'd like to welcome Trishna Baradia. Trishna is a health advocate and patient engagement expert. She's a multi-award-winning health advocate and patient engagement consultant working to get the patient voice heard louder, stronger, and more effectively throughout the healthcare journey and medicine's development lifecycle. From the UK, Trishna works nationally and internationally with multiple stakeholders, including industry, healthcare systems, clinicians, and patient organizations. She lives with several long-term physical and mental health conditions herself, including multiple sclerosis. Trishna has particular expertise in good patient engagement practices and development of patient engagement strategies, diversity issues in healthcare and clinical research, communicating with patients, and patient involvement in scientific publications. So we're extremely happy to have you here with us today, Trishna, and maybe you could take a minute to say hello yourself.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. I think it's hopefully going to be really interactive. We're going to have lots of questions and lots to discuss.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Trishna. Super excited to have you. So yeah, let's dive right in. Now, obviously, I mean, everyone's here to really talk about the need. I think there's no doubt there's a need to include the patient voice in an increasing fashion within clinical research. So something that perhaps historically we haven't done the best job at, especially on the sponsor side. And as we plan our research program. So one of the things we wanted to start off the conversation today with is, bouncing off of your experience, thinking about everything you've gone through, both as someone who's experienced a rare disease and also as a patient advocate. One of the things we wanted to talk about is really how can companies better align themselves with some of the patient advocacy groups that are out there? What can they do better? Or perhaps they haven't even thought about it in the first place. Maybe some of your initial suggestions there.
Sure. Well, I think it'll be pertinent to really sort of go very right to the beginning and actually talk a little bit about how I got involved in the first place. because I got involved, like many patients do get involved in clinical research. So, you know, as you mentioned, I've had several diagnoses. I live with several long-term physical and mental health conditions. And when I was diagnosed, it wasn't a great experience. So I was given this life-changing diagnosis, and then no information, no support, no guidance about medicines, clinical research, or support and services that were available. And like many people, particularly within the rare disease space, I had to learn about everything myself. And clinical trials wasn't even put on the table as an option to explore. And this is what really spurred me into getting involved in advocacy, initially within MS, but then my work then expanded across disease areas. And as a result, I've been involved in lots of different areas of clinical trial design. So things from setting research priorities to helping to design protocols, consulting with solutions providers who are designing solutions to try and make the patient experience within clinical trials less burdensome. So, you know, through e-consent or patient portals. Also the development of patient materials and information sheets, all the way through to the dissemination of results and the development of things like plain language summaries. Now, I think it's important to first of all sort of give that as a bit of an example, because I think what can often happen is that organizations don't necessarily know where to start when it comes to aligning with patient organizations, connecting with patient leaders, patient advocates, because firstly, they don't know what kinds of things they can get involved in. When we talk about clinical trial design, for instance, often the only thing that people think that patients can get involved in is the design of the protocol. But actually, I've demonstrated just through the work that I've done, there are so many different points along that research sort of life cycle that patients can get involved in. And then going back to your original question, how can companies sort of better align themselves with patient advocacy groups? How do they even identify these groups or the patient advocates? And knowing where to look is often a question that I'm asked. You know, there are lots of different places, but in rare disease specifically, it can often mean having to go into really deep landscape mapping sometimes, because these groups may not be as visible or as easily identifiable. So some rare diseases, for instance, they don't even have their own patient group. And I actually discovered this in a project that I was working on in a rare neuromuscular condition. And there wasn't a specific patient group for this particular condition. Advocates, patients, and caregivers were joining the larger, more general neuromuscular patient groups. So, as I said, it might be about digging deep to identify the right people. Sometimes it will be a case of talking to someone who can then connect you with someone who knows someone. But honestly, when you finally make that connection, it really is invaluable. And then talking about connections, I think social media can be a great channel. But again, you need to know what you're searching for. So identify the right hashtags to follow for a specific patient community, the right keywords to search that the patient community is using. See who or what organizations are talking about. You know, often a tweet or a post on social media can lead you to other people or organizations that might be relevant. So again, it's about that cascade of information rather than expecting to sort of hit the jackpot the first time. And then some other areas include identifying healthcare professionals that can recommend patient advocates. That can be a good way. And then there's also some emerging areas where advocacy groups and patient advocates can be identified, and that's through events, publications, and also patient networks. So by events, I mean conferences, webinars like this, meetings, Many are including patient advocates, and if we're talking about rare disease specifically, then it's often highlighted within the session summaries. So look out for those if you're attending congresses or conferences, or you're going into webinars or meetings. And this is the same with publications. So there's an increasing call for patient authors to list patient in their affiliation so that you can easily identify them in searches, for example, on PubMed. And then patient networks. Now they're a place where advocates are increasingly going to in order to connect with other advocates. But a lot of these networks can be searched publicly. So networks like We Go Health, for instance, can help industry connect with patient advocates and patient leaders. So those are just some of the areas. I think, as I said, often there's a willingness to connect with patient advocates and patient groups, but often people just don't know where to start looking. And I think that's a really good place to begin, is, you know, looking at those various channels where you can identify the patient groups, but be prepared to dig deep, because it's not as easy as, for example, maybe just doing a Google search and expecting to find the right group for your particular project first time round.
Fantastic. I wanted to jump back. I think you said something very interesting at the outset when you were talking about your initial diagnosis, what you went through as a patient. And you made the point that patients are interested in being participants at every step of the way. So I think sometimes on the industry side, we think, okay, set up an advisory board to design your protocol, which is absolutely essential, but then forget about the patients other than the ones that are participating in the trial. But could you just comment, this is a bit of a tangent, but just in terms of your comment on patients' willingness to be involved at multiple touch points within the development process?
Yeah, so in order to make any trial relevant, patients basically need to be involved right from the very beginning. I'm talking about the setting of research priorities. There's a really great graphic which has been done by UPATI, which is the European Academy for Patient. I can't remember the exact words for the acronym, but basically it's a patient academy that helps to train patient advocates in clinical research. And they have a brilliant graphic, and it shows the whole timeline of the development of a product. Now that could be a drug, or it could be, you know, it could be applied to, for example, you know, an app that is going to help patients. And essentially, you need to be involving patients right at the very start, because actually, if you're not even answering the most relevant research question, how is the end result going to be relevant for the patient community? It won't be. And so involving patients right from the very beginning, and then as you said, through multiple touch points, is crucial. It's also about providing that check along every step of the way. Is this truly patient-centered? Are we focusing on the patient needs? And the only way to do that is to be collaborating with patients at every single point. Now, we know that there is a trust issue when it comes to pharma. We can't get away from that. However, one of the reasons why there is a trust issue is because often patient groups and patient advocates, patients have been asked for their insights, and it's been done in a way that actually their insights don't really matter, because they're being asked too late to change anything. So why are they even being asked in the first place? Making sure that people are being involved right from the very beginning, and when they can really influence the end result is the most important. And I think that's something which industry particularly can really improve upon. Too often I see, you know, the ticking the patient-centric box, where actually they're asking patients, but the insights that they're gathering aren't going to make that much of a difference because you're already too far down the line.
That's a good point. I think too, if we think about humanizing the process, if you're just ticking a box, that's the exact opposite of humanization of the development process, right? So that's absolutely essential.
And patient communities know what they want. And especially within rare disease, There are many patient communities that are very vocal and they're very knowledgeable and they're experts in their disease area. So they know what they want. They know what they want industry to be looking at and the challenges that they're facing that they want the solutions to. So actually, we need to be asking them, because we also have to remember that the healthcare professional lens or the industry lens on what they think living with a condition might entail is often very different from, you know, the actual people who are living with the condition themselves. And when I talk about people who are living with the condition, I'm not just talking about the patients, but I'm also talking about caregivers as well, because their voices is just as important. And I'm sure we can talk more about the caregiver element later on.
Absolutely. You know, it occurs to me too, especially for within the biotech and pharma space, if you think about the fact that you could be spending a decade developing a specific drug, if you lose the touch point along the way, you know, treatment methodologies are changing, the patient experience is changing. Within 10 years, anything can change, right? So even more essential, why wouldn't you be constantly checking in with the patients in terms of advisory all along the way?
Yep. No, it's so true. It's so true. And also, as for example, as more research is done within, you know, various disease areas, and more drugs come onto the market, then patient priorities change. Because at the beginning, when there's nothing available, then often it's well, we need something. Once more medications become available, then those priorities change, and it's actually we want something that does this and that does that and has fewer side effects and can, you know, the administration method is more suitable, etc., etc. I've seen this in MS. So, you know, if we were talking about MS about 20, 30 years ago, there was nothing available. And then we got the injectables, which were, you know, had a, you know, the efficacy level compared to what's available now was, you know, much lower, but it was something. Now we have drugs which are, you know, highly effective, but have, you know, the side effect profile is potentially, you know, less tolerable. But we've moved from injectables to IV to now oral medications, and there's such obviously a plethora of options available that actually patients are demanding more, and they're saying, well, actually this is what we wanted to do. I think that's important to remember. This isn't, you know, things don't stand still within patient communities at all.
That's a great point. And the patients have the right to demand more. So why wouldn't they be included in the process?
Exactly.
So if we're thinking, I think it's absolutely abundantly clear that the patients want to be involved within the entire process. So we go back to the idea of these patient advocacy groups. I think one thing coming more from the industry or the sponsor side is often we're thinking about what can we get from the advocacy group. But I'm interested in your opinions on what else can we give to the advocacy groups. So I think especially within rare disease, you might have smaller groups, less well-funded groups. What are some of the things that a sponsor can think about in terms of giving back to these advocacy groups, considering how much they're going to be helping them within the development program?
I think this is a really important topic that you've raised, because often when we think about patient engagement, it is very much, it's thinking about it in a one way, sort of that one dimension, when actually it shouldn't be. It's a partnership, so there should be mutual benefits. And, you know, there's the obvious, you know, that's running effective and successful trials to develop new treatments. But beyond that, many patient groups, not just in the rare disease space, they will often welcome the opportunity for things like project funding and capacity building, you know, sponsorship and opportunities to participate in congresses, you know, maybe through participation in sponsored symposia, for example. That really gives these groups exposure and also educational opportunities, for instance, because, you know, it can be difficult to be able to build on your own education within a certain disease area if many of these congresses and conferences are actually they're only for medics and scientists. They're often then patients and patient advocacy groups, they're not allowed to join these congresses unless they're part of speaking panels. So that can be a really good way of sort of giving back. I also think that general awareness raising and education about, clinical research is something that, sponsors can really help with. As I said, so patient groups often lack the resources to be able to do everything that they'd like to do. So, providing, educational grants, for instance, to support them to be able to produce some of these materials that would have mutual benefit, because if we have more people, more patients aware of clinical research and how it works, then there's going to be a mutual benefit there. And it's also about helping to educate and aid people to become patient advocates themselves, because it doesn't just happen like that. People who are becoming patient advocates need to be able to educate themselves. They need to have those opportunities. So I think that's definitely a key way that sponsors can give back to the patient groups and patient advocates.
That's great. And what you're describing is a true then collaboration rather than the one-way street that maybe exists in the dynamic today.
Definitely.
And I think, a lot of times sponsors think, okay, as I involve a patient advocacy group, it's going to help my enrollment in the clinical trial, especially within rare disease when the patients can be hard to come by. But do you have any thoughts on maybe some of the other benefits that maybe a company wouldn't necessarily think of? But what are some of the benefits that the sponsor receives from aligning themselves with the patient group?
Well, so we know that recruitment, retention obviously improves. Also, the likelihood of drug launch. So there are studies that show that in patient-centric phase 2 and 3 trials, the likelihood of drug launch is higher than in non-patient-centric trials. And that actually goes across disease areas. Different disease areas. So this particular study looks at oncology, neurology, and also rare disease. As I said, the same goes for recruitment. And actually in rare disease, you see a significant increase in decrease in recruitment time in patient-centric trials. So if anyone wants a reference for that study, then I can give it to you and you can send it out after the webinar if you'd like. I think what's really important is sponsors need to be able to understand what it's like to live day to day with a disease in order to be developing drugs and solutions because it's not just about the drugs development process, it's also about those the beyond the pill solutions as well that pharma companies are working on. In order to make sure that they're relevant, then you need to be understanding what it's like to live day to day with a disease, and also to make sure that they work for participants in trials or the people who are using an app or who are accessing the information. So patients and patient groups can help sponsors to learn about this, to understand this. We have to remember that patient needs have to be at the heart of what sponsors do. The only way to even know what those needs are is to talk with patient groups and patient advocates and caregivers, because you can't just assume. And even within a particular patient community, those needs may not be the same across every single patient. So being able to understand that spectrum and those nuances is key.
Great point, which is even though we are today focused on rare disease, this applies across the spectrum, right? So this is basically any indication these statistics apply. So I think it's a good point that rare disease or not, these are methods that are really helpful to any clinical program.
Yeah.
I was thinking too, I think a lot of us are thinking quite a bit, and I know it's one of your areas of focus is diversity in clinical trials. So in terms of, we have a recent FDA draft guidance on increasing diversity in clinical trials, but is that also a way that working with a patient group can help in terms of meeting some of those really unmet needs within the clinical trial scenario?
So it can do. I always say that with a bit of a caveat, because many patient groups actually have a diversity issue themselves. So they're not necessarily reaching diverse voices. They're not, there are a lot of underserved communities within specific patient populations. So I always say that with a bit of a caveat. And when it comes to the diversity question, there are a few things. First of all, diversity and inclusion and accessibility aren't necessarily all the same things, and we have to remember that. If we're talking about diversity, we have to think about diversity in the context of a specific disease area. Often when the diversity questions being spoken about, what happens is that we focus on, it usually ends up being race and ethnicity. And that's really important. However, in some disease areas and some conditions, that may not necessarily be the most important thing when it comes to diversity. We have to remember that in some, conditions that, for example, they usually affect older populations, early onset, people who have early onset disease, that's where we're talking about diversity. We're also talking about looking at, if we're talking about clinical trials, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Often the inclusion and exclusion criteria will mean that some people will automatically be excluded because, for example, in some patient populations, BMI tends to be higher. Well, if there's a certain BMI cutoff, then you're already excluding certain people. Comorbidities, that's the big one. We need to be looking at all of this: disability, socioeconomic background, gender, rural versus urban, even down to, people who are working versus people who aren't working. We can't look at diversity as a blanket, let's just look at this diversity question. It has to be specific to the disease area that you're dealing with, because that's when we truly make the diverse question pertinent, and that's when we're really looking at those tangible solutions. And then those solutions, we're looking at, well, you need to look at what are the challenges, what are the barriers, why is it that certain groups aren't accessing clinical research? Going to patient leaders, and again, this is when I talk about you have to dig deep sometimes. It might be that there is one patient leader in a specific patient group, patient subgroup that's doing some fantastic work. You have to dig deep to find them because they don't have the resources to, for example, make sure that they come up top in a Google search. So being willing to delve deeper and sort of go through some of those layers to reach those people who can then connect you with other people within that subgroup, I think is really important. It's a really complex topic, and we could probably dedicate an entire hour just to the diversity question. But it is something that I think it's good that we're looking at. I think it's being simplified too much, and by simplifying it, actually we're not getting to the root of the actual question itself.
Fantastic points. I think, like you said, we've discovered now the topic for our next webinar. So you're all invited to the next webinar. We'll discuss diversity in greater detail. But yeah, thank you for that. A bit of a tangent, but I think it's important at least to touch on for today's topic. Okay, so switching gears a tiny bit, but also obviously related. So one of the biggest buzzwords or buzz phrases right now is decentralized clinical trials within research. And I think you see a lot of companies, both on the industry side and providers, kind of scrambling to implement these technology solutions and different ways of conducting trials outside of the traditional setting. But interested in your opinion in terms of the decentralized clinical trial model, what are some of the factors specifically within the rare disease setting which might be more challenging, and maybe which sponsors are not thinking about specifically to their rare disease program?
Sure. So I think decentralization of trials can definitely help improve things like accessibility to clinical research. But we have to remember that by bringing some or all of a trial to someone's home or a community setting, we're also placing more responsibility on the participants and the caregivers. Now, they need to be confident to be able to take on that responsibility. If we're talking about, for example, filling out PROs on their own, administering medications, using things like wearables to measure certain outputs and things like that. With rare disease particularly, I think building this confidence might be more difficult because there may be generally less information out there about someone's specific disease and less support. So, imagine if you've just been diagnosed with a rare disease and then you're offered a decentralized trial and you're expected to take on all that responsibility when you might not even know about the disease itself and what it might mean for you. So helping patients to build the confidence to take on some of this responsibility in a decentralized trial, I think is going to be key. And that can be through education, it can be through support, it can be through, whatever other means. But I think that's crucial to making sure that they feel comfortable within a decentralized trial. Also, I think if someone's not going to a site and they're not meeting others in a trial, or they're not meeting with the site staff, it can reduce the opportunity to exchange experiences and also feel supported in what can already often be a very lonely journey and a very isolating journey. We have to also remember that in some cultures, and this actually goes back to the diversity question, in some cultures there can be stigma attached to illness, and so people might not be comfortable with having a trial brought to their home, having a nurse come to their home, for example, for a blood draw. We have to be mindful of all of this and remember that decentralization may not work for everyone. I think it should be utilized as an option rather than as a single solution. And anybody who's works with me or who's heard me speak knows that I'm all about choice. And for me, what decentralization does is it offers another choice and a possibility for people to get involved. It's not necessarily the be all and end all. It's not the magic solution to everything within clinical trials. And I think that's really important to remember.
Absolutely. And oftentimes what we think about too is the possibility of perhaps a hybrid model where there is that component, maybe, there's a decentralized component for some of the assessments or procedures, but there is that connection perhaps to a traditional center or patient, some sort of a patient connection to then increase the engagement of the patient and the comfort level.
Yes, and it's also it's about giving the patients the choice, and they, even within a hybrid model, there may be some people who the decentralized part actually doesn't work for them, or the site-based part doesn't work for them. So there should be those options there and the flexibility there to be able to make it work for the patient. And I think that's the most important thing. If you can make it work for the patient, they're more likely to stay in the trial, they're more likely to adhere to the protocol, they're more likely to understand their responsibilities within the trial. And I think that can be forgotten, very often, that we need to be making this work for the participants and the caregivers as well.
Yeah, and so it sounds like it's even more crucial in this scenario to have a patient advisory board, actual patients involved in the protocol development process and the program process.
Yes, because that's the only way you're going to be able to gain the insights of the people who are involved. Also, I think that feedback loop is really important. So during the trial itself, create an environment where people feel that they can give feedback, midway through a trial. If something's not working for them, allow them to give feedback as an iterative process. Also, at the end of the trial, make sure you're getting feedback from participants and feedback to them as well. If there's going to be if, for example, it's a phase 2 trial, which will then go on to a phase 3 trial, say, well, actually, your insights were really helpful. These are the things that we're potentially going to change the next time round. Or if something isn't going to be done, why not? Patients will often give their insights and then never hear anything, and that can be really frustrating. So making sure that feedback loop is complete is, again, really important.
Yeah, I think too, sometimes as an operations person myself with that background, I think sometimes on the sponsor side, we're so afraid of the idea of a protocol amendment or a pivot mid-study, but it really might be essential, right? Because sometimes you have to take lessons learned even midstream, even mid-program. And
Exactly.
that can really, if you have the patient voice, that could potentially save a program, right? If you're able to pivot even just slightly.
Yes, it can do. And I think the weight of the patient voice can't be underestimated. So if something needs to change, and obviously you need to get approvals for it, saying that actually this is what the participants, this is what the patients want, gives a huge amount of weight to then being able to get approval for an amendment or a change.
Yeah, and I was thinking too about the point you made in terms of the end of study assessment. Oftentimes, again, from an operations perspective, we think, the final clinical study report, the final data, that's the patient voice, but it really isn't. So are there ways that you've found are especially effective at the end of the study to, gain the patient voice or get that perspective, maybe other methods, surveys, or things like that?
Yeah, so things like survey, basically any methods that are, can be utilized in order to gain patient insights. Again, make things work for the patients. So some patients, may be comfortable with a one-on-one interview, or maybe more comfortable in that scenario as compared to, for example, an advisory board. Some people may just want to fill out a survey. They finish the trial and that's it. I think be creative, be flexible, and make it work for the patients, because that's when you will be able to gather the most insights and the most effective and valuable insights. Because then people are doing, you've got to remember, people are living with a disease, they're trying to live their life, and all of this takes time and effort. So you need to make it as easy for them as possible, as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Moving back to just specifically to the DCT model too, we had talked about the importance of, that sometimes the patient's feeling disconnected or perhaps overburdened because now it's coming into their home. I know one of the things that a lot of companies are excited about is, wearables, the idea to transmit data to the cloud instead of having to go to the hospital setting. But what are your thoughts on, the potential issues there in terms of now throwing all of these wearables to a patient with a new diagnosis, or what can we do to maybe better that process?
So I think one of the key ways, particularly when it comes to digital, I'm not seeing this enough, is that anything that can make the logistics of the trial easier needs to be created, co-created, co-developed with patients. This isn't happening enough. So, whether it's something like a reimbursement and travel solution, whether it's a patient portal, whether it's a wearable, for somebody. So in wearables, for instance, is it something that patients can actually use? If you have a patient community where dexterity and fine motor skills is an option, but you've got tiny little buttons on this wearable, that's not going to work. What often happens is that these solutions are developed and actually no patients are being involved in that, because the company developing the solution is forgetting about who the end user is. We always have to bear that in mind. I've spoken to many a vendor that has basically never engaged with patients. They've designed the solution, and what they think is meeting that sort of patient-centeredness box is getting user feedback once the tool's already in use, when actually, not much can be changed at that point, and actually it's wasting a lot of development time, when if you are connecting and engaging with patients right at the very start, you can co-develop those solutions. I think one way that we can potentially drive this is that when sponsors are considering vendors, I think it should be a criteria for selection. Ask vendors whether they've worked with patients on their solutions, because every vendor is going to obviously say that theirs is the best solution for patients. Obviously they will, but how do you know that's actually the case? As I said, I've worked with many vendors that have never, up until the point when I've started working with them, have never actually engaged with patients. So I think this in itself will start to push vendors towards working more with patients, co-developing those solutions. Because if they know that it's something that sponsors are looking for, then I think they'll do better in incorporating the patient voice. Now, I don't want to sort of say that all vendors aren't doing this. There are some vendors that are, and they're doing this really well. But in my experience, there's just not enough of this happening within the sort of that development stage of these solutions that could potentially be a real game changer for helping to make trials logistically much easier for people who are participating.
You make a great point there. I mean, today we're talking about rare disease, and we're perhaps a bit leaning towards pharma biotech. But for our medtech colleagues as well, those who are developing devices and diagnostics, the patient voice is still essential, right? So this is not just a pharma problem; it's also a medtech issue that can be addressed with patient groups and the patient voice, right?
Yes, and I mean, and
Excellent.
as I said, everything is all interconnected because, you know, in a clinical trial, you've got the sponsor, you've got the med tech companies, you've got the CROs. This isn't something that should only be shoot down to industry. This is about getting all the stakeholders on board and everyone working towards that same goal, which is a more patient-centered clinical trial.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think another thing which is always when you mention rare disease and you're on the sponsor side, recruitment and retention enrollment tends to be the issue that pops right into everyone's minds because it by nature of the rare and ultra rare population, it's difficult to enroll, especially for global trials. So thinking about perhaps why that is the case. So not only is there a smaller patient population, but that there might be additional issues for the patients themselves. What are some of the things that sponsors should keep in mind? What are some of the burdens that might prevent a rare disease patient from participating in a trial?
So I think, I mean, there's various, obviously, there's various burdens. I think, and again, yes, there's specifics to rare disease, but actually this goes across like all disease areas. So generally, I'd say, so there's physical burdens, there's emotional burdens, and there's financial burdens. So with physical, it's to do with the impact that the disease has on someone's day-to-day living, and I've already touched on this. We need to be able to understand the support that is required for things like travel, administration of medication, help with filling out, for example, PROs and things like that. All of these things, if that support isn't there, then it can prevent someone from participating in a trial because they're then thinking, well, you know, how am I going to get to the site? How am I going to fit this into, for example, you know, they might be working. How am I going to fit this into my day-to-day living? I actually said something to someone the other day where so people don't realize how much energy it can take for many of us who are living with long-term conditions just to make it out of the house. Having that understanding of what the physical impact is of living with a condition is crucial because that is often one of the reasons why people don't do things, whether that's participating in a clinical trial, whether it's socializing, whether it's being able to work in the job that they want to work in. That physical burden can be immense. And then I said there's the emotional burden. So for many people, trials represent hope. And even more so in rare disease, where it might be the only option for some people in order to get some kind of medication. And this sort of expectation really needs to be managed because we know that not all trials will have successful outcomes for all participants. Managing this disappointment when it comes to, for example, efficacy or side effects is really key. You know, what happens if a particular participant sees benefit in a trial, but overall the trial is deemed unsuccessful because it's not met its endpoint. You know, to then be told that the drug, despite it working for you, won't be made available to you any longer. It's not going to go on to, you know, for example, the next stage of the trial, so it's not going to go on to be licensed. That can be gut-wrenching. And all of these things need to be considered and they need to be managed accordingly in an empathetic way. And then last but not least, and I've sort of touched on this, you've got the financial burden. So living with a long-term condition means that people often have higher expenses and also lower income. So participating in a trial might take them away from work. It could cost them, for example, in travel, or, you know, for example, losing days off work. I've heard many discussions about whether financial incentives should be offered in clinical trials. I'm of the opinion these aren't incentives. They might just be basic requirements that someone needs in order to participate. No participant should be out of pocket because they're participating in a clinical trial. So expenses need to be reimbursed. We should be finding ways to be able to compensate for people's time and loss of earnings if they're having to take lots of time off work in order to participate, because we'd like to think that employers are going to be understanding, but often they're not. And so, we need to remember all of these things and understand that these are challenges that many people face and questions that they have to ask themselves if they're considering taking part in a trial.
I completely agree. I think too, sometimes from the sponsor side, we think of, oftentimes we design a program, we start the trial, and then when we receive a request for, transportation support or for a stipend, it's almost something that we consider after the fact or in response to a request from a patient. But I think that can make the patient feel like they're asking for something that perhaps they don't deserve, that we feel like is not appropriate. So why are we not doing that at the outset, immediately offering, Uber has a clinical trial transport group. There's companies that will work with us. So why are we not instituting that right at the outset? And it sounds like if we were engaging the patient voice early on, we would think about things like that within our program, rather than always using it as a stopgap measure, as something to address a problem that's now arisen during the trial.
Yes, and I think also, again, it's about the atmosphere and the environment that's created within a clinical trial. I've reviewed numerous sort of study information sheets and informed consent and things. I have a real issue where it says in the patient materials, we will reimburse reasonable travel costs. Who's to say what is reasonable? At the end of the day, whatever somebody needs to spend in order to get to a site, that's what they should be reimbursed. By putting in that one word, you're then putting the onus onto a patient thinking, oh, well, what's reasonable? Oh, am I allowed to take a taxi? Actually, that's what I need in order, for example, if they need to be able to get back in order to work for the rest of the day, and they need to take a taxi because that's quicker. And then they think, oh, but maybe I should take the bus because maybe taking a taxi isn't considered reasonable. Take the word reasonable out. Basically, participants shouldn't be out of pocket and they should feel comfortable asking for what they need. Patients generally will not take advantage. They have this, an understanding that all they really want is to be able to get from A to B and be reimbursed for what it's cost them, basically. And so I think looking at that and looking at how do we make sure that patients aren't feeling like they're asking for something that that they shouldn't be asking for. How do we make sure that they're comfortable? And yeah, as I said, I mean, that's one of my bugbears. And I always, whenever I have any kind of, study information sheets or anything like that, I always cross it out in a big red with a big red pen, kind of virtual digital pen, and say, no, who's to decide what's considered reasonable? Just, reimburse what they need, or give them the support that they need. And also making it very obvious and saying in participant information sheets, for example, if there is anything that you need, please let us know. Very often that isn't even included, and so people don't feel that they can even ask for things, which is again what you need for them to do in order to make it as easy as possible for them to participate in the trial.
Yeah, and I think too, for thinking back on the sponsor side, if you think about the fact that it is true that might impose maybe an increased financial burden for the sponsor at the outset in terms of planning and logistics, but if that then has a direct effect on enrollment and retention, you can exponentially reduce your overall cost by reducing the timeline of your trial, increasing your enrollment rate, making it easier for the patient as a partner, right? So it really, it's kind of a no-brainer, but I think at the outset it can be a bit scary to think, now I have to pay for these travel costs, I have to build this into my trial budget, but it really is worth it for the sake of the patient and for the sponsor.
It is. And look, if we're going to start talking about figures in the grand scheme of things, it's not actually that much. If we're thinking about how much it costs to develop a drug, it's not going to break the bank. So,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
if at the end of the day, it means that you're going to keep people in a trial, you're going to have faster recruitment, etc. It's a no-brainer.
Absolutely. I know I see that we're starting to run out of time. There's still so much to talk about, but just one last thing. You've mentioned a couple of times the role of the caregiver within the trial process. So
Yeah.
maybe just a couple of minutes on it as we're thinking about not only the patient, but also the caregiver as a partner, both a partner to the patient and a partner in the design and trial process. What are some of the things that the sponsor can think about in terms as they're designing a trial? Are there things to think about in terms of the caregiver's involvement as well?
Always. So I call caregivers the enablers. They're often the ones that will enable someone to participate in a trial, because without their support, it might just not be possible for somebody to take part in a clinical trial. Now, this is really obvious when it comes to pediatric trials, but it's less obvious sometimes when it comes to adult trials. We often have this image about the caregiver being someone who washes, clothes you, feeds someone, helps someone to physically move about. But actually, it may not be any of those things. It might be wider support that the caregiver is giving. So in the context of a trial, it could be to do with the logistics. So traveling with someone to the trial site. I've actually personally turned down trials because it's too far, and I rely on one or other of my parents to be able to take me to the site. It might be the financial support, especially, as we've just been talking about. If someone isn't able to pay for travel up front and wait for reimbursement, and they're out of pocket, then they may need financial support from their caregiver. It could be support at home, so completing assessments and PROs, administering medications, supporting and dealing with side effects. All of these things, sometimes it's the caregiver that is actually having to manage all of that. So you have to understand the caregiver perspective in order to make sure that the trial is also going to be relevant and feasible in practice for them as well. Even if the caregiver hasn't accompanied someone to a trial site, they might be the one that's making sure that food is cooked and household tasks have been done whilst the patient is away, especially if it's a long visit, or people have families. What happens to children if somebody's having to make a visit to a trial site? All of these things, they make a difference, and they can factor into someone's decision making about whether or not they're going to take part in a trial. And this is why it's important to remember. So when I talk about the patient voice, it's always inclusive of the caregiver as well, because as I said, they're often the enablers. Without gaining their insights, we may not be actually designing a trial that is fully feasible for everyone that's involved in that participation, because actually it might not just be the person with the disease, it will be the caregiver as well that is participating indirectly in that trial as well.
Those are fantastic points. So perhaps when we're talking about the patient voice and the patient advisory board, it's really the patient and caregiver voice and the patient and caregiver advisory board in terms of developing a program.
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I see that we're running up against the end of our webinar. We had just a couple of questions from the audience we thought maybe we could pose. So I'll bring these up. And thank you, Tricia, so much for the insights so far. So let's see what we have in terms of questions. Looks like we have one from the audience that says, how can a sponsor work with multiple patient groups if there's more than one for a particular rare disease? Should only one organization be selected to partner with? Maybe Tricia, if you could take that first.
So it really depends on the scope of and also the individual project. So I particularly like multi-group collaborations because we have to remember that patient groups themselves have their relative strengths, and these should really be played to. It can be tricky sometimes balancing the politics that happens, and it does happen. But I think the benefits of collaborating really need to be encouraged. If only one organisation is being selected, then there has to be clear rationale and criteria for selecting that particular organization. And then I would make that process actually transparent so that you're avoiding any kind of bias or favoritism or even alienating the groups that haven't been selected. And this really comes back to good patient engagement practice, you know, where you have to define the need and then the criteria for selecting the best organization or the best people to collaborate in order to fulfill that need for a specific project.
Makes sense. Thank you. Another question, I think this is one that we've talked about a bit, but perhaps just to reemphasize. So the question is, do you suggest to use a true decentralized clinical trial model with everything decentralized, or a hybrid model using both DCT and traditional sites? And perhaps you could add to that, if not traditional sites, maybe some sort of a in-person component. Maybe your thoughts on that, Trishna?
So I think, I mean, I've already said it. I think I believe in choice. You know, I don't think we should be looking at whether something is completely decentralized, hybrid, or totally site-based. We should be thinking about this in the long term. We should be thinking about this as providing the options for, and also remembering that for some people or patient communities, fully DCT might not be the most suitable. It might not be the most practical either. And even within a patient community, there is likely to be differences with what people want. So choice is the future for me. And I think that's something that if sponsors really want to be able to get patients involved quicker, retain them, etc., providing that choice is going to be the key.
Yeah, and I would agree with that from a logistics perspective as well. So if you start off sort of forcing the true DCT, although it's a fantastic tool and for some programs absolutely the perfect choice, within a lot of programs, if you start off trying to force people into the only DCT model without a hybrid option, you may be stuck down the road where it's a bit late to pivot in terms of your technology, your setup, even your regulatory process. So I would agree that the choice is really important, and sometimes a hybrid approach might be the best, especially within rare disease. Excellent. Well, it looks like we are out of time. We have just, I think, 2 minutes left remaining. Trish, I want to thank you so much. This was a fantastic interactive conversation. I hope for our participants today it was also meaningful and useful, especially for those planning programs. So I want to, again, thank everyone for attending today's fireside chat. Just to remind everyone, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to view a recording of today's discussion. We'd also appreciate your feedback on today's discussion as well, both Trishna and myself, so please feel free to share it in the survey that will appear following the end of the fireside chat today. So again, Trishna, thank you so much, and thank you also for the work that you do within patient communities and in this whole process. We really want to thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.